Welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is the deep dive where we get into the historical sources, into the theology, and try to understand it on its own terms. Today we're opening up John Calvin's Institutes, which can be pretty dense, but we're giving you a shortcut. We're going straight to his critique of the church government of his day. Our mission is to really pull apart what Calvin saw as the proper scriptural roles for presbyters, deacons, and bishops, and then show how he argued they were just completely destroyed by greed and, well, politics.
And it's not just a rant. That's the thing to get here. This is a systematic theological assessment. He's looking at the office, the call, how it's financed.
Right.
And he's measuring it all against Scripture, and this is key, against the ancient church canons. He's citing councils like Chalcedon and Aquileia. The main argument you see him building is that the hierarchy kept all the names, the titles, the fancy clothes, but the actual reality of spiritual government was gone. It had been overthrown.
A hollow shell.
Completely. And when you see the contrast he draws, it reveals this shocking system of patronage, of financial abuse, and just massive moral failure.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The presbyter, the pastor. Calvin is very clear that this is a job, an active duty, not just a title you hold.
Right. He defines the genuine office as a call to govern the church. It's a verb, not a noun. The absolute core of the duty is to lead and feed the people.
So what does governing look like? Is that just giving sermons?
It's more than that. It's the whole administration of what he calls the spiritual kingdom of Christ. It means taking on the burdens of the office.
The practical stuff.
Yes. The care of discipline and the administering the sacraments. He sees the word, the sacraments and discipline as the tools you use to keep the community spiritually healthy. If any of those fail, the church itself just withers.
And he also talks about the structure of that leadership, doesn't he? Mm-hmm. He argues for something more collaborative than a strict top-down hierarchy.
He does. It's this idea of collegial leadership. He argues that in the early church, presbyters were meant to rule the church in common with the bishop.
So they were colleagues.
Exactly, colleagues in the pastoral office. The bishop was first among equals, sure, but the governance was meant to be collective. That was a huge point for Calvin because in his day, the presbyter had been reduced to a mere servant.
And the feeding part of the duty, for him, that's non-negotiable.
It's the absolute center. The flock is fed by the preaching of doctrine. His stance is so sharp here. He says if a man isn't given a place to teach, he has no lawful office to exercise.
He really goes after the priests who didn't preach.
Oh, he's scathing about it. He calls it a dumb priesthood. Men who held the title but thought preaching was, beneath their dignity or too much work. He asks, how can you call yourself a steward if you keep the keys to the storehouse, the word of God locked away from the people?
So that's the ideal, the active, teaching, governing presbyter. Now let's pivot to the reality he was seeing. What had the office become?
It had been completely warped. The work of ruling and feeding was just gone. It was replaced by a ritual. The office was reduced to one single function, to perform sacrifices.
The Mass.
The Mass, which Calvin, of course, called an impious profanation. And it wasn't preaching, it was just chanting or muttering masses, often in a cloister somewhere, with no real interaction with any congregation.
It sounds like the role became transactional, not spiritual.
That's a perfect way to put it. It stopped being about service and became a transaction. The priest became a mercenary who, sells his labor for a fee. Calvin describes them wandering around trying to get paid for performing a mass for the dead or some other ritual. The job wasn't stewardship anymore. It was an hourly wage gig.
This is where that ship's captain analogy really helps make sense of it.
It does, doesn't it? A real captain is on the ship, steering it through storms. He's present. He's working.
Right.
The man Calvin criticizes gets the title captain because he knows someone important. He lives in a mansion miles from the sea, and he thinks he's doing his job by just waving a flag from his balcony once a day. He never sets foot on the ship.
And the ship, the church, is just left adrift? No one's at the helm?
Total spiritual desolation. The congregation is left untaught, undisciplined, uncared for. How can you be a shepherd if you've, as he says, never seen a sheep of his flock?
Which brings us right to the residency mandate. You can't be an absentee shepherd.
You can't. And this is where he pulls out the ancient church canons to back him up. He cites the Council of Chalcedon.
What did it say?
It said there should be no ordinations free of pastoral obligations. You had to be assigned to a specific community. You had to live there. You had to work there. It was a safeguard against exactly this kind of corruption.
And the system in his day made a mockery of that.
A complete mockery. These bishops and presbyters didn't see their churches as spiritual responsibilities. They saw them as farms.
Just a source of income.
Right. They'd hire a cheap steward, a vicar, to manage the farm, collect the rent, and send it back to them while they lived in luxury somewhere else. The office was just a title attached to a revenue stream.
So if the primary office of pastor was so broken, what happened to the supporting roles? Let's talk about the deacon. What was that office originally for?
It was a ministry of mercy. Simple as that. It goes back to Acts 6. The deacons were responsible for the stewardship of alms.
So managing the church's charity fund, basically.
Basically, yeah. Their job was to gather alms and then distribute them to the needy widows, orphans, the poor. They were the financial officers of mercy. It was a check against the clergy becoming greedy.
But like the presbyter's office, it got corrupted. It shifted from practical work to just ceremony.
A total shift. In the 16th century, the deacon's duties were all about assisting the priest during the Mass. They'd minister at the altar, handle the chalice and paten.
The cup and plate.
Right, and maybe they'd read or chant the gospel. The whole thing turned the diaconate from this vital, distinct calling of social service into just a stepping stone, an internship for the priesthood.
And the consequence of that is, well, it's pretty horrifying for the people who actually needed help.
The social welfare work just vanished.
It was abolished. And the money that was supposed to go to the poor, well, it was either eaten up by the clergy's greed or spent on what Calvin calls superstition.
What does he mean by that?
He means building gigantic ornate stone churches, erecting statues, buying gold vessels for the altar, all while the living temples, the poor, were starving.
That's a powerful phrase, living temples.
It is. His conclusion is brutal. He says the poor receive nothing more of those alms than if they were cast into the sea. He argues they'd rather let thousands of people starve to death than melt down a single golden cup to feed them. The priorities were completely inverted. So once you see that the jobs themselves were empty, the next question is, how did the wrong men get these jobs in the first place? And it all starts with stealing the authority to appoint them. The disenfranchisement of the people. Calvin was pretty strong on the idea that the congregation should have a say.
He saw it as their divine right to elect their own bishop. But that right was systematically taken away. First, the whole power was transferred to the canons alone.
The cathedral chapter.
Right. This group of already powerful clergy just usurped the people's vote. The congregation's assent and subscriptions, which were required by ancient practice, just disappeared.
And what was their excuse for doing this?
The usual one, really. They claimed that public elections were messy, they led to tumults and factions, they said the common people were too emotional to make a good choice.
And that they, the educated canons, knew better.
Of course. Calvin just dismisses that as a flimsy pretext for a power grab. The end result was that the new bishop was just presented to the people to be adored, not to be examined. They were just spectators.
But the power didn't even stay with the canons. It became a political football.
It did. Once the power was centralized, it became a bargaining chip. The next step was collusion with secular rulers, princes, kings, dukes. They got the right to nominate bishops.
So church offices became political rewards.
Largesse of princes is the phrase Calvin uses. They were handed out as rewards for political loyalty or military service. It was a complete usurpation. Spiritual authority was being treated like a piece of land you could just give away.
So you end up with bishops who are, what, courtiers?
You end up with bishops who are hunters and falconers. Seriously. Men who were good at training the king's birds were given charge of a whole diocese. And these men were forced on populations that didn't want them, didn't know them, and certainly didn't choose them.
It's just staggering to think about that a man's skill with a falcon could make him a spiritual leader.
It shows you how far things had decayed. The qualifications were just gone.
Let's talk about those qualifications, or the lack of them. The examination of learning was seen as, what, too old-fashioned.
Completely old-fashioned. They didn't want theologians who could preach. They wanted lawyers who could argue in court, manage property, and handle money. The ability to preach the gospel was not a valued skill.
He gives a pretty shocking statistic on this.
It's almost unbelievable. He says that for 100 years, scarcely one man in 100 appointed to these offices had any real grasp of sacred learning. They were managers, not ministers.
And what about moral qualifications? The ancient rule was that a bishop had to be above reproach.
That was totally ignored. This is the moral collapse. Calvin is blunt. He says bishops were often drunkards, fornicators, gamblers.
Wow.
He says if you judged the current bishops by the standards of the ancient canons, you'd be lucky to find 1 in 100 who wouldn't be immediately thrown out of office.
So these high spiritual offices actually became rewards for bad behavior.
In some cases, yes. Bishoprics became prizes for adulteries and panderings. They were given to men who had performed some scandalous service for a prince or a patron. The whole idea of moral purity was just off the table.
And the whole system ran on money, on simony.
Simony was the engine, the buying and selling of church offices. Calvin says, scarcely one benefice in 100 is conferred without simony. You either bought the position with cash or you got it through what he calls the sordid currying of favor. Just shameless bribery and flattery.
Which led to some truly absurd people getting these jobs.
It was almost comical if it weren't so tragic. He says bishoprics were given to barbers, cooks, muleteers, and such dregs of humanity.
Muleteers
But
again.
in children, just boys, they were simply the favorite servants or the young relatives of the powerful patrons who controlled the appointment.
And the Pope's role in all this was basically to sign off on it, to grant the exceptions.
He was the one who made it all possible. The Pope would grant dispensations to ignore all the canonical laws. This is how you end up with boys scarcely 10 years old being made bishops.
A 10-year-old bishop. It's just
Calvin calls it a monstrous transgression, and he's right. It shows that the office was seen purely as a financial asset. If you let a child be in charge of souls and property, you clearly don't believe there's any spiritual substance to the job at all.
And yet, they still went through the motions of an ordination ceremony.
Oh, they had to keep up appearances. But the examination was a pure mockery. It was a stage play.
What would they ask them?
Ridiculous things. Can you read a bit of the Mass? Can you decline a Latin noun? The kind of thing a schoolboy could do. It was all scripted.
And the final moment of the ceremony is the worst part.
It's the institutional lie at the heart of it all. Someone stands up and formally asks if the candidate is worthy, and another man who's never met him, who knows nothing about him, just recites his line. They are worthy.
Just a complete farce.
Calvin sees it as them shamelessly mocking God. They had to perform the ritual, but they denied the spiritual reality. It was just a play to legitimize a financial transaction. And that transaction, that financial engine, was the benefice system. To understand the corruption, you really have to understand how the benefice worked, or rather, how it was broken.
So, a benefice was originally the salary, right? The support for a minister doing his job.
Right. It was the priestly living tied to active service in a specific place. Your title required a duty.
But the hierarchy found a loophole. They redefined the word title.
They did. And this is the crucial move. They redefined title to mean simply an income sufficient for their support. The duty part was dropped.
So the income was detached from the work.
Completely detached.
Yeah.
And that gave birth to what Calvin calls idle benefices.
And these were what, exactly?
They were positions like canonries or chaplaincies. They were titles that had become nothing more than salaries for, as he puts it, elegant men who earn their keep by singing. They had no real ministry function. The job was gone, but the paycheck remained.
And because it was just income, people started collecting them. This is the abuse of pluralism.
It's the logical next step. If a spiritual office is just a source of revenue, why not have more than one? Calvin talks about canons laden with 5, 6, or 7 benefices.
Collecting 7 salaries while doing 0 jobs.
Precisely. He said they treated the church office like prey cast to dogs to hunt, or like enemy loot to be grabbed. It was about accumulating personal wealth, not administering a church.
The no-show job analogy really clarifies this for today.
It's a perfect modern parallel. You have a publicly funded job meant to provide a service, but in this corrupt system, the job title is just a name on a payroll. It's an income stream you can give to your nephew.
And the nephew collects the check every month but never shows up to the office.
Never.
Yeah.
And he might have 5 other no-show jobs in different cities. That is exactly how the church's money was being siphoned off by men who were, for all intents and purposes, embezzling spiritual salaries.
And all this wealth created a debate about glory, about what a bishop is supposed to look like. What did the ancient church say was true glory?
The ancient church valued humility and service. Calvin quotes St. Jerome, who said, "The glory of the bishop is to provide for the poor."
Not to be rich himself.
No. Jerome said it was the disgrace of all priests to seek after their own riches. Calvin also cites the Synod of Aquileia, which stated, "Glorious is poverty in the priests of the Lord. The old standard was service to the vulnerable."
And the hierarchy of his day had turned that completely on its head.
They had. They went in for what Calvin calls false splendor, and they even tried to justify it theologically. They said they were fulfilling prophecies about the glory of the church.
Oh, by building palaces.
Magnificent palaces, elegance of apparel, a great retinue of servants. They wanted to live like princes. Calvin just shoots this down. He says the prophets were talking about spiritual gifts, not accumulating filthy lucre.
The firefighter analogy works well here.
It really does. True glory for a firefighter is being covered in soot after saving a family. It's the evidence of service.
Right.
The false glory is the fire chief who spends all the department's money on a pristine gold-threaded uniform and refuses to go near a fire because he might get it dirty. The outward show replaced the actual substance of the job.
And this was only possible because they were plundering the church's funds. How was that money supposed to be used?
Historically, church income was divided 4 ways: to support the bishop, the other clergy, the church buildings, and the poor. And the poor were supposed to get at least half.
But they didn't.
Not even close. Calvin says the clergy seized the money like thieves dividing spoils. The funds were eaten up by the voraciousness of the priests, and the poor were left with nothing.
And we come back to that idea of spending on superstition, on buildings instead of people.
That was the ultimate moral failure for him. They would pour money into statues, gold vessels, and extravagant churches. Meanwhile, the living temples, the poor who are the actual dwelling place of the Spirit, were abandoned. He saw it as a form of idolatry, loving the gold more than the people God commanded them to care for. So when you pull back and look at the whole system, it's just one of total institutionalized neglect. It was designed to pay a man a princely salary for doing no actual pastoral work.
All the real qualifications, doctrine, a holy life, the consent of the people, actual service, they were all replaced by a system that ran on corruption. It was, as you said, a formless chaos.
That's his term for it. He says the bishops no more think of feeding the flock than a shoemaker of plowing. They just saw their churches as farms to be milked for revenue. The result was a desolation that kept the mask of a church but was totally alien to what Christ instituted.
The shepherd became a landlord. The servant of the poor became their chief plunderer. And the preacher went silent.
Before we finish, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. Calvin's use of the ancient canons, like Chalcedon. Why was that so important for his argument? Why not just stick to the Bible?
That's a great question. It was a really smart strategic move. By citing these ancient, universally respected church councils, he was doing 2 things.
Okay.
First, he was proving that the corruption he saw was new. It was a deviation. The papal hierarchy had broken with its own best traditions. Second, and maybe more to the point, he was framing the Reformation not as an innovation, but as a restoration.
So he's saying we're not the radicals here, you are.
Precisely. We're not starting a new church. We are trying to get back to the pure ancient church order that existed before your systemic corruption took hold. It completely flips the script on who the innovators are. They were the innovators of corruption. The reformers were the restorers of antiquity.
So it was a way of claiming the mantle of tradition for the Reformation. Yes. It showed the papacy had abandoned not just scripture, but the most revered figures and councils of the early church on all these key issues: morals, elections, and especially money. #tagouttrip.
We've walked through Calvin's analysis, and what you see is this picture of a complete systemic failure of church government. The outward mask was still there, the titles, the ceremonies, but the spiritual reality was just gone. It was hollowed out by simony, by idleness, and by the abolition of the ministry of the word and care for the poor. And understanding this critique gives you, the listener, a pretty clear set of parameters for thinking about spiritual authority. It helps you ask the right questions. Is the focus on governing and actually feeding the flock? Or has it slipped into something else? Patronage, self-enrichment, ceremony without substance.
Calvin's argument really shows how the call, the work, and the resources of an office are all tied together. When one of those breaks, when the call is stolen, the work is abandoned, and the resources are plundered, the whole thing just collapses into corruption. It's not just a story about the 16th century, it's a timeless warning about how institutions decay. We saw that the ancient church said a bishop should be deposed for being a drunkard or gambler, and that his real glory was in caring for the poor. So here's a thought to leave you with. If those are the benchmarks, what practical steps could a church today, one that's committed to reform doctrine, take to guard its offices from the more subtle modern forms of idleness and self-seeking, from the modern no-show Job? What happens when a title, any title, outlives the active duty it was created to perform?